number one priority, disrupting their ability to plan and conduct attacks against the homeland, which is our number one focus. With coalition support and our partners on the ground, the Syrian Democratic Forces, we've been successful in taking back a large amount of territory from ISIL over the past year. And in recent months alone, the SDF's operations in Shadadi and most recently in Manbij have really cut the line of communications between Raqqa in Syria and Mosul in Iraq, and also, as importantly, eliminated one of the critical nodes for foreign fighters and the flow of resources into and out of Syria, again related to that external threat, which is our primary focus. Over time, the size of the Syrian Democratic Forces and the number of Arabs in those forces have grown. And for those who don't watch it very closely, the Syrian Democratic Forces, largely a Kurdish force of about 30,000, and we have about 14,000 Arabs now that are associated with that force. To put that in some perspective, last year at this time, we probably had a few hundred vetted Syrian opposition forces on the ground that we were supporting. So there's been a significant growth, 30,000 Arabs, 14,000 Arabs associated with them, and then 2,000 more vetted Syrian opposition that are actually working with us and the Turks along the Turkish-Syrian border. So the size of the force has grown, and we're going to try to grow it even more, even as we balance Turkish concerns about our support for the Syrian Democratic Forces. With respect to Russian activity in Syria, there's absolutely no doubt that it has complicated things, and Russia has put itself in a position to actually influence the eventual political solution. And needless to say, recent events have complicated the situation with regard to Russia, and I suspect many in this room, the Chief included, will be working hard on that over the next few days. To say that, you know, I had a group of chiefs of defense in Berlin on Monday to talk about the counter-ISIL campaign, and I said, you know, if we were tasked to lock ourselves in a room all day and develop a complicated scenario, a complicated political military scenario, I don't think we would have had the imagination to come up with the Syria scenario and the complications that we're dealing with as we deal with ISIL in Syria. But on balance, I would say the pressure we put on ISIL in Syria has degraded their capabilities, it's reduced their territory they hold, it's limited their freedom of movement and reduced their resources. And probably, most importantly, I believe we have started to chip away at the narrative of inevitable success, the narrative of a caliphate. Much more work to be done. Our focus now in Syria is operations in Raqqa, which is decisive terrain for the physical caliphate and really the one remaining critical node for external operations inside of Syria. In Iraq, the situation, as you well know, is complicated by the political landscape, sectarianism, and Iranian influence. And success there is going to require that we continue to develop Iraqi and Kurdish security forces and enable their operations with intelligence, advisors, logistics, and combined arms support. Well, mindful of the complex challenges that we face in Iraq, I mean, I'm encouraged by the growth of Iraqi security forces, the growth of the Peshmerga, and their success in places over the last year, in places like Ramadi, in Fallujah, in the western Anbar province, and more recently in the area that surrounds Mosul. They've actually gained a significant amount of momentum. And to me, those operations actually are indicative of what's in the art of the possible. Moving forward, and I think you've seen this in the media, and some of you are either just returning from a deployment perhaps or going on deployment, we're focused on Mosul. And just as an aside, we assess today that the Iraqis will have in early October all the forces marshaled, trained, fielded, equipped that are necessary for operations in Mosul. And the timing of that operation now is really just a function of a political decision by Prime Minister Abadi, and we will be in a position to provide whatever support, whatever reinforcement those forces need in order to be successful. And again, I guess I'd wrap it up by saying I think it's indisputable that over the past year we have gained momentum, we have taken back significant territory, we have limited the enemy's freedom of movement, we have been able to get after some of the leadership, and we have chipped away at their resources. You know, there's many reasons why I can tell you that we've had success over the past year, but it's worth noting, and I say this not to pander to the crowd, but it's worth noting that the critical enabler of the counter-ISIL strategy has been air power. Since 2014, airmen have provided air interdiction, ISR, close air support, humanitarian assistance, and global reach to the campaign. It's been air power that has had the most devastating effect on the leadership, resources, and freedom of movement of ISIL. And it's also been the most important factor in supporting our partners on the ground. But victory in Raqqa and Mosul won't be the end. Figuratively speaking, it's the day after Mosul and the day after Raqqa that actually makes the difference. And of course, that's figuratively speaking for we're not going to be successful in defeating ISIL in either location unless the basic issues of governance are addressed. That will be how ISIL is defeated in the end in Iraq and Syria. But we will have done our part for the military to set the conditions where that can take place. And of course, we still have to deal with ISIL and other trans-regional threats from Southeast Asia to West Africa. And as you know, again, many of you involved in that, we do have forces deployed in West Africa. We're currently supporting operations in Libya. We have forces deployed conducting counter-violent extremist operations in East Africa, as well as Afghanistan, and we're doing a significant amount of partnership capacity building in Southeast Asia. So the joint force, I mentioned the counter-ISIL fight to give you an update. That's front page above the fold, but the joint force is clearly decisively engaged in dealing with violent extremism. It is a trans-regional threat, and we are globally deployed to deal with that trans-regional threat. The challenge of violent extremism and those 4 state threats challenges that I mentioned earlier have a number of implications for the joint force. The first implication, in my view, is foundational, and that is we need a balanced inventory of capabilities with sufficient capacity that allows us to defeat and deter potential adversaries across the range of military operations. As a nation that, by definition, has to think and act globally, we don't have the luxury choosing between a force that can fight ISIL and one that can deter and defeat a peer competitor. Nor do we have the luxury of choosing between meeting our current operational requirements and developing the capabilities that we need to meet tomorrow's requirements. And I think getting that balance right, getting that balance between meeting our current requirements and our future requirements will frankly define for all of us the next few years and probably one of the more important non-operational challenges that we have as a team. In this crowd, I don't really have to say much about fiscal uncertainty, and I suspect that's been the topic of discussion here over the last couple of days. And I guess what I'd say is the Bipartisan Budget Act, it might get us through FY17, but we still have $100 billion of sequestration looming, and again, to airmen, I don't have to talk about the bow wave of modernization requirements that confront us in the future. And we also have those readiness challenges I mentioned earlier in each of the services, and particularly in the Air Force, that are going to take some years to address. And I think predictable and sufficient funding is going to be important. And look, I'll carry that message tomorrow to the Senate Armed Services Committee, and the Chief carried it last week. But we're going to have to do more than buy hardware to get out of the trough that we're in. We're going to have to expend some intellectual capital and develop disruptive, innovative ways to meet our requirements. And the example that I use when I go around, I say, you know, since 2003, we have increased the ISR capacity available to the combatant commanders by 1,200%. Since 2007, we've increased the numbers of ISR platforms over 600%. And today, when we sit around with the operations deputies, the J3s of the world, and the combatant commanders, we're meeting somewhere less than 30% of their ISR requirements. That is a challenge we cannot buy our way out of. And I think we're going to have to think really hard about how do we collect, how do we analyze, and how do we disseminate information at the tactical, operational, and strategic level to feed decision-making. The problem we're confronted with is not how can we afford to buy more Predators. The problem we're confronted with is not how do we expand the enterprise as we know it. The problem we're confronted with is making decisions and ensuring that our leadership and our airmen have the information that they need to make decisions. So we just need to make sure as we go forward and we start thinking about prioritizing and allocating resources that we're actually shooting on the right target. And again, to me, shooting on the right target is decision-making, not more Preds. And I hope that is music to the ears of our airmen because, again, we've come to you time and time again to increase capacity. We'll increase 30 more caps, I think, across this fit-up. That'll take us from 60 to 90. And so then we'll be at 34% of what the combatant commanders say they need. Secretary James, I don't think that's probably the path that we want to be on. There's a lot of other examples, and I guess my real point is that the path we're on is not going to get us there. And to paraphrase Winston Churchill, ladies and gentlemen, we're out of money. We have to think. A second implication is the need for us to consider how to most effectively use the military instrument of national power to address today's challenges. You know, I believe we need to develop more effective methods to what we've seen of Russian behavior in Crimea, the Ukraine, and Georgia, what we've seen of China in the South and East China Sea, what we see out of Iran across the Middle East. Each of those nations in different ways, you know, fully leverages economic coercion, political influence, unconventional warfare, information operations, cyber operations to advance their interests. And they do it in a way that they know we don't have an effective response. And I refer to that dynamic as adversarial competition with a military dimension short of armed conflict. I'll say it again, just adversarial competition with a military dimension short of armed conflict. I describe it that way not as gray zone or hybrid because those words all have baggage. The fact of the matter is I'm trying to zero in again on what exactly are we seeing, and we are involved in adversarial competition with those state actors. There's a military dimension to that adversarial competition, but they, unlike us, are able to integrate the full range of capabilities that their states possess to advance their interests. And again, they're doing it in a way that kind of mutes our response. Our traditional approach, where we're either at peace or at war, is insufficient to deal with that dynamic. And for that reason, I don't find the current phasing construct that we have in our operations plans particularly useful, because that causes us to bend certain activities, certain authorities, and certain capabilities in a way that reflects that we're either shaping or we're fighting. And I think at least the Chief was probably around last year when we had all the combatant commanders assembled down at Quantico for just kind of a review of where we are globally. And at the time, General Breedlove was still the commander of the European Command, and I said, Phil, what phase are you in EUCOM right now? You know, and he kind of looked at me and he said, well, we're in phase 0. And I said, what phase do you think Russia is in right now? And he paused and he said, well, they're probably in 2 or 2.5. And then, you know, I asked Admiral Harris the same question. And I said, what phase do you think China's in? He said, well, they're probably in about phase 2. And so my question is, how long can our adversaries that are competing with us be at phase 2 or 2.5, and we remain at phase 0 before we find ourselves at a pretty significant disadvantage from a posture perspective? I think we also, and clearly, again, this crowd knows, we need to develop a more effective framework within which to deter cyber attacks. Attributing threats, managing escalation, and probably as importantly, hardening ourselves against cyber attacks are all issues that require more work. One of the most, to me, significant implications of all that I've spoken about today is that any future conflict is going to be trans-regional, multi-domain, and multifunctional. And I think that's a marked change from how we fought in the past. Information operations, cyber activities, space operations, and ballistic missile technology are all part of what has fundamentally changed, in my view, the character of war in the 21st century. And we're going to see such capabilities fielded by both state and non-state actors, and they're going to look for ways to harness those capabilities in a way that exploits our vulnerabilities. Conflicts are going to quickly spread across combatant command geographic boundaries and domains. And the current fight against violent extremism is an example of a trans-regional threat, but if you consider just for a minute North Korea, I think that really highlights the point I'd want to make. You know, back in the 1990s, we had a regional strategy. And we had an assumption that if there was a conflict on the Korean Peninsula, it would probably be isolated to the Korean Peninsula. And we would deal with it with air power, we would deal with it with ground forces, but we could contain the conflict to the Korean Peninsula. Then the North Koreans developed ballistic missile technology that began to threaten their neighbors. And of course, over time, they developed not only ballistic missile technology, but intercontinental ballistic missile technology, cyber capabilities, trying to develop anti-space capabilities. And very quickly, I think you can see